Chapter 1. The House on Pine Ridge. The funeral was quiet. My grandmother, Eleanor May Carter, had always said she didn't want a lot of fuss, and true to form, only a handful of people gathered at the old Pinewood Chapel at the edge of town. Rain fell gently that day, softening the crunch of gravel under our shoes as we followed the casket. My father stood silent with his head down, one hand clenched tightly over the other. My aunts dabbed their eyes, more out of the rhythm of grief than real sorrow, I thought. They hadn't been close to her in years. Grandma had lived in that creaking house on Pine Ridge for over 60 years. It sat near the woods, half swallowed by ivy and fog. It was the kind of place that had stories tucked into its corners, with old wallpaper curling at the seams and light switches that crackled when you touched them. After the service, the family gathered back at the house. We weren't grieving loudly. Not really. There was tension, though, woven between every sentence. My father had taken care of her in her final year, visiting nearly every day. But now that she was gone, the house was ours to clear out. And that meant going through decades of things that smelled like dust, dried herbs, and old paper. I offered to take the attic. I wasn't particularly close to Grandma, but she had always been kind to me. She'd call me Caleb, my little oak, and send me letters during my lonely college years. When I was young, she used to hum old songs while brushing my hair back, saying, "There's more history in your bones than you know." The attic was stuffy and dim, filled with boxes of forgotten holidays, yellowing books, and a trunk that hadn't been touched in years. I didn't think much of it until I found the diary. It was tucked beneath a pile of crocheted quilts inside a wooden chest. Its leather cover was cracked, the edges worn thin. On the front, barely legible, were the initials EMC, Eleanor May Carter. I opened it cautiously, not expecting much. But the entries were vivid, personal. The handwriting was neat at first, then grew shaky over the years. Some pages smelled faintly of lavender. It started in 1953 and covered everything: her marriage, pregnancies, garden notes, neighborhood gossip. And then, between a passage about preparing for my father's 4th birthday and canning peaches, I found it. "I don't know if I'll ever sleep again. The crying won't stop. Not from the others, just from him. The 5th. No one can know. Not now. Not ever." I reread the entry 5 times. The 5th? What 5th? Our family always talked about the Carter children. 4 of them. My father, his 2 sisters, and their younger brother, Daniel. There was no mention of a 5th child. Not in photo albums, not in family stories, not even in the official documents we found when organizing the estate. I sat there in the attic, heart pounding in my throat, suddenly aware of how loud the wind had grown outside. The trees creaked, and somewhere downstairs, a door shut slowly. Probably the wind. I turned another page. The next entry was dated a week later. "I told Richard we can't keep him here. He didn't say anything for a long time. Just looked at the wall. He said, 'Then we don't.' That was all." A chill ran down my spine. Who was this child? And what happened to him? Chapter 2. The 5th name. The attic was exactly how I remembered it as a kid. Dusty, dim, and strangely still. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling like tired arms, holding up the weight of generations. Cobwebs curled in the corners, and old furniture stood like forgotten sentinels beneath moth-eaten sheets. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe an old photo album, or letters. Something personal. But the moment I lifted the lid of an unmarked box in the far corner, I felt it. The air changed. Not colder, not warmer. Just heavier. Inside, everything was neatly packed. Yellowing papers. A stack of birthday cards tied with ribbon. 2 pressed flowers between wax paper. And then, near the bottom, wrapped in a linen cloth, was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, looping, always in black ink. I sat down on the dusty floor and opened it carefully. The first pages were dated in the early 1950s. She wrote about weather, chores, my grandfather, the children. I recognized the names of my uncle, my aunt, and my mother. 4 children. That was always the story. But then, about halfway through the diary, on a page dated March 12, 1961, There was a sentence that made me freeze. Ellen was sick again today. She's so quiet lately, barely speaks. I wonder if the others notice how much she's fading. Ellen. I read it again. That name, Ellen, did not belong to anyone I knew in our family. There was no Ellen. I flipped through the next few pages. And there she was again. Ellen wouldn't eat. I found her in the closet with her knees tucked up, humming to herself. Tom says she needs help, but I don't know who to ask. We've told no one she exists. That line. We've told no one she exists. My breath caught. My grandmother had a fifth child. It didn't make sense. We always grew up hearing the same stories. 4 kids. No more. There were photo albums labeled The Four, portraits in matching outfits, birthday parties with 4 cakes. I was sure of it. But this wasn't a name mentioned once in passing. Ellen's name came up again and again through the following weeks of diary entries. And the tone of the writing shifted. My grandmother's words became more frantic, less poetic, almost like she was afraid. I closed the book and sat in silence for a long time. Dust swirled in the beam of light coming through the attic window, and I could hear the faint sound of the clock ticking downstairs. There was a missing person in our family. Someone real. Someone who'd been erased. And for some reason, no one had ever spoken of her. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Room. I didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet in that eerie, unfamiliar way it always is after a funeral. When the guests leave, the flowers start to wilt, and the air settles into something mournful and still. I lay in my childhood bed, the one I hadn't slept in since high school, the diary beside me on the nightstand. Ellen. The name repeated in my mind like a whisper I couldn't trace. The next morning, I waited until everyone else had left or fallen into their grief routines. Coffee, laundry, pretending everything was okay. Then I went back to the attic. This time with gloves, a notebook, and purpose. I returned to the box where I found the diary. Beneath it, buried under folded linens and a stack of old church newsletters, I found something else. An envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a faded red wax stamp that had cracked with time. Inside was a single photograph. 4 children stood in a garden. My mother, my aunt, and my 2 uncles. Their faces were young, familiar, smiling awkwardly in old-fashioned Sunday clothes. But off to the side, half hidden behind a bush, was a 5th child. A girl. Her head was turned, so I couldn't see her face fully. But something about the tilt of her body and the way her hands clutched the sides of her dress made me stop. She didn't look posed. She looked like she had wandered into the photo by accident, or wasn't meant to be seen at all. On the back, written in the same looping handwriting as the diary. Spring 1960. All 5 of them. I sat back on my heels. My pulse thumped in my ears. She was real. Not a metaphor. Not a childhood imaginary friend. A 5th child. I took the photo and diary downstairs, spreading them on the dining table like evidence at a crime scene. I tried not to let my thoughts spiral, but they did anyway. Why would my grandparents hide a child? What could be so terrible that they erased her from family history? I needed more than a name and a photo. I needed proof someone else remembered her. So I did the only thing that made sense. I called my mother. She picked up after a few rings, sounding distracted and tired. When I asked if she could come by the house again, alone, there was a pause. But she agreed. When she arrived an hour later, I didn't waste time. I showed her the photo and waited. Her reaction was subtle. Too subtle. Her eyes scanned the picture. She lingered on the edges. Her brow furrowed just slightly. Then she smiled, a little too tight. "Where'd you find this?" she asked casually. "In Grandma's attic," I replied. "With her diary." I watched her closely. "Do you remember her?" I asked, tapping the 5th child in the photo. My mother was quiet for a beat too long. Then, almost mechanically, she shook her head. "No. Must be a neighbor's kid. You know how photos were back then. People just wandered into frame." I wanted to believe her. But her eyes didn't meet mine when she said it. She left soon after, claiming she had to get back home. But as she pulled out of the driveway, I noticed her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Her shoulders hunched. She didn't wave goodbye. I went back inside, diary in hand. That night, I read it cover to cover. Near the end, one final entry, dated in 1963, stood out. It's done. The room is sealed. She's safer this way. We all are. And beneath it, scratched into the page in ink so heavy it had bled through. Forgive me. That was when I remembered something odd from my childhood. A door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Always locked. Always cold to the touch. We used to call it the closet room. But no one ever opened it. No one ever talked about it. I stood there now, decades later, in front of that same door. And for the first time in my life, I realized it wasn't a closet. It was a room. A forgotten one. And I had the key. Chapter 4. Behind the door. The key didn't look like much. It was small, brass, and taped inside the back cover of the diary. I almost missed it. But once I peeled it off and felt its weight in my hand, something changed. The hallway seemed colder. The air heavier. I stood in front of the locked door for a long while, listening. There was no sound from inside. No draft, no creaking of floorboards. Just silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I slid the key into the lock. It resisted, like the door itself didn't want to be opened after all these years. But it turned with a reluctant click. The handle was cool to the touch. I pushed. The door groaned open slowly, as though waking from a decades-long sleep. Inside, the air was stale. The kind of heavy, unmoving air that only exists in places long forgotten. Dust particles floated like tiny ghosts in the shafts of light that filtered through a high, narrow window. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and something else. Metallic, dry, old. It was a small room, maybe 10 by 12 feet. The wallpaper had peeled in long strips, revealing cracked plaster beneath. A child's bed sat in the far corner, white painted iron, rusted at the joints, with a thin mattress and faded pink sheets. A single wooden chair. A bookshelf with a few toys and children's books. A dresser with ornate handles. One missing. And above the bed, a drawing tacked to the wall, the paper yellowed and curling at the edges. It was a crayon sketch. A stick figure family. 2 parents, for children holding hands. Off to the side, separated by a scribbled black line, stood a 5th child. No face. Just long hair, and 2 large dark eyes drawn with unsettling precision. My skin crawled. I walked further in, trying to take it all in. This wasn't a storage space. This had been lived in. Someone had spent years here. Someone who had drawn on the walls, stacked books, carved tiny scratches into the floor beneath the chair. Tiny notches, maybe from counting days. Or years. I opened the dresser drawers. Children's clothes. Carefully folded. Out of fashion even for the time. Dresses. Socks, small sweaters with hand-sewn patches. One drawer held nothing but old cassette tapes, each labeled with dates and short titles. Week 3, Rain Again, Her Birthday, and the final one, It Ends Tonight. My hand trembled as I picked it up. There was no cassette player in the room. But I knew where one was. My grandfather's old study, down the hall. I left the room, closing the door gently behind me, as if not to disturb whatever memories lingered in the stale air. In the study, I dusted off the player, inserted the final tape, and pressed play. The tape crackled to life. At first, silence. Then, my grandfather's voice. Quieter than I remembered, but unmistakably his. If you're listening to this, I'm gone. And you found the room. A pause. A sharp breath. We didn't know what else to do. Ellen wasn't like the others. She'd change. During storms. During full moons. Sometimes we'd wake and she'd be standing in the hallway, staring at nothing, whispering. Sometimes we'd find things moved, rearranged, broken. Once, I found her standing outside, barefoot in the snow, humming a song none of us knew. The voice cracked then, like he was fighting back tears. She wasn't a monster. Just a little girl. But something inside her. It wasn't normal. And no doctor could explain it. We couldn't risk what she might become. Static surged, and I could barely make out the next part. We kept her there. For her safety. For hours. I hated it. I hated myself. But we didn't know what else to do. If you're hearing this, don't open the wall. Let it stay buried. Let her rest. Then the tape clicked. Rewound. Stopped. I stared at the machine, the sound of my own heartbeat filling the room. The wall. Back in the room, I hadn't noticed anything unusual at first. But now, the memory struck me. The left wall. It looked newer. The paint didn't quite match. And the baseboard trim was slightly uneven. Subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. I returned, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. I tapped the wall. Hollow. And on the floor, beneath the window, the carpet had been pulled up and nailed back down. She wasn't just kept in this room. There was a room inside the room. And something was behind that wall. Chapter 5. The Hidden Room. My fingers trembled as I knelt to examine the baseboard. The nails were old, rusty, but fresh enough that someone had put in effort to conceal whatever lay beneath. The wooden floorboards around the area felt loose under my touch. I pulled at the edge of the carpet where it was uneven, prying it up slowly until I exposed a square outline in the floor. Hard hammering, I looked back at the wall. The faint seams and the uneven trim suddenly made sense. I stood and pushed hard against the wall. It gave way slightly beneath my palm. "Wait!" a voice whispered behind me. I spun around. My mother stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear and sorrow. "I told you to leave it alone," she said quietly. "Some things don't belong in the light." "Mom," I said, voice shaking. I found the diary. The photo. The tapes. She was real. Ellen was real. She looked away, biting her lip. Yes, she was real. And she was family. But she was also dangerous. We thought keeping her hidden was the only way to protect her and all of us. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Grandma say anything?" She wanted to, but she was afraid. Afraid what people would think. Afraid Ellen would be taken away. We all carried the secret, and it broke us. I gestured to the wall. "There's something behind there. A hidden room. We have to see." She swallowed hard. "If you do that, you're not just opening a door. You're opening old wounds. But if you're set on this, then I'll help." Together, we moved the loose floorboard, revealing a dark hollow space beneath. A small door set flush into the floor appeared, complete with a rusty metal latch. I lifted the latch, heart pounding louder than ever. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward, coated in dust and shadows. The air smelled of earth and damp wood. We exchanged a glance, fear and resolve mingling, and stepped into the darkness. The secret below was waiting. Chapter 6. Secrets Beneath the Floor. The narrow wooden stairs groaned beneath our feet as we carefully made our way down into the darkness. Each step felt heavier than the last, like we were descending not just into a hidden room, but into the depths of the family's buried past. The stale, damp air wrapped around us, thick with the scent of earth and mildew. My flashlight barely pierced the shadows, casting long, trembling beams on the cold stone walls. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a cramped chamber no larger than a small closet. The rough walls were made of uneven stone blocks, worn by time and moisture, their surfaces mottled with dark stains. The floor was dusty and littered with debris, fragments of plaster, bits of dried leaves, and something more personal. In the far corner stood a small iron-framed bed, its mattress thin and stained, covered with a faded blanket that looked decades old. On the bed's edge lay a tattered doll, missing an eye and several stitches, as if it had weathered countless storms. I crouched down and noticed scattered papers on the floor, yellowed and brittle. They were drawings, simple sketches of stick figures and homes, a child's attempt at capturing the world. The handwriting was faint but unmistakably small and shaky, like the tentative scrawl of a child learning to write. One drawing showed a family standing together, but one figure was always apart, outlined in heavy black crayon, eyes dark and hollow. My breath caught when I saw a name carved crudely into the wall above the bed. Ellen. The letters were deep, uneven, etched as though by desperate fingers. Beneath the name were a series of numbers. A date? A countdown? They were scratched in a hurried, trembling hand. I turned toward my mother, whose face was pale and drawn. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she whispered, "This was her prison. The room where she was kept hidden, where she was left alone. My chest tightened. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a place of isolation, fear, and sorrow. The diary's fragmented entries, the locked attic, the erased photos, they all pointed to a terrible secret buried beneath layers of silence. I noticed fresh footprints in the dust near the wall, a sign that I wasn't the first to be drawn here since Grandma passed. Then, on the floor near the bed, half covered by a broken floorboard, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. I opened it with care. Inside were pages filled with Ellen's childish handwriting. There were letters, a few short poems, and a desperate plea. Please don't forget me. I am still here, even if no one sees. The room seemed to breathe with her presence, trapped in the walls, trapped in time. My mother's voice broke the silence again. We thought keeping her hidden would protect her, from what she was, and from what she could become. But in the end, it only tore us apart. I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me. I had uncovered more than a forgotten room. I had uncovered a fractured soul and a family's darkest pain. There was more to find here. I could feel it, and I was ready to face it. Chapter 7. Echoes of Ellen. The notebook trembled in my hands as I flipped through the fragile pages. Ellen's handwriting was uneven, sometimes messy, sometimes painfully clear, like the thoughts of a child caught between confusion and hope. I could almost hear her voice whispering through the words. One page was filled with drawings of storms, jagged lightning bolts, swirling clouds, and a small figure curled in the corner, eyes wide and terrified. The thunder comes and I change. They say I'm different. I hear the voices when the rain falls. Another entry was a poem, scratched hastily but beautiful in its sorrow. I'm here but not here, a shadow in the light, locked away from the world, in the dark of the night. My mother sat beside me, silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. After a long pause, she said quietly, she wasn't like the others, not just sick, but something more. Sometimes she would vanish for hours. When they found her, she was often scared, confused. Why didn't you help her? Why keep her hidden? I asked, voice trembling. We were afraid. Not just for her, but for us all. The doctors said they didn't know what was wrong. Some nights, she would scream until dawn. Things broke in the house. And then there were the stories. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Things nobody else saw. I swallowed hard. Ghost stories, mental illness, or something else. I looked back to the notebook. Tucked between pages was a small folded letter, yellowed and worn. Carefully, I unfolded it. It was addressed to my dearest Ellen, signed by my grandmother. The letter spoke of love, regret, and a desperate hope for forgiveness. It begged Ellen to find peace someday, and for the family to remember her not as a secret, but as a daughter. Tears streamed down my face. This was no longer just a mystery. It was a legacy of love, pain, and silence. And it was up to me to break the silence. Chapter 8. The Vanished Child. The letter weighed heavy in my hands as I folded it carefully and tucked it back into the notebook. My mind raced with questions. What had really happened to Ellen? Why had she been hidden away? And why had the family erased her from memory? I spent the next few days digging through old records, letters, and newspaper clippings stored in the attic and my grandparents' study. Most were routine, births, marriages, anniversaries. But then I found a brittle, yellowed article from 1964. The headline chilled me. Local girl missing. Ellen Harper disappears without a trace. The article described a 5-year-old girl last seen near the family home. A search had been launched, but no sign of her was ever found. The police had no leads. The community whispered about strange lights seen near the house and unexplained noises at night. I read the article over and over, each time feeling the ache of a lost child growing stronger. I called my mother again, my voice barely steady. Ellen disappeared. Her silence was a loud confirmation. She left, she finally said, voice cracking. No one knows where. Some say she ran away, others that she was taken. Grandma never spoke of it after that. Why? I pressed. Because some secrets are too painful, she whispered. And some things you bury so deep, you pretend they never happened. That night, I sat in the attic, surrounded by the fragments of Ellen's life. Her drawings, her diary, the locked room, and the photograph with the faded fifth child lurking in the background. I made a promise to her. I would find the truth, no matter what it took. Chapter 9. Uncovering the Past. The following morning, I returned to the attic, clutching the diary and the old newspaper clipping. I needed answers, not just from paper and shadows, but from the people who still lived with the silence. I reached out to my Aunt Marjorie, Grandma's eldest daughter. She hadn't attended the funeral, and I suspected there was a reason. After some coaxing, she agreed to meet at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. When I showed her the diary and the photo with Ellen's faint figure, her hands trembled. "I never wanted to talk about her," she said softly, eyes downcast. "Ellen was different. She frightened us. Mom tried to protect her, but it was hard. Sometimes I heard her crying at night from the attic room. Why did Grandma hide her?" I asked. "She thought it was best. For all of us. But it tore the family apart." Dad was angry, scared. And after Ellen disappeared, the silence just grew. "Do you know what really happened to Ellen?" Marjorie shook her head, tears welling up. "No one does. Some say she ran away. Others whisper things that sound like stories from nightmares." I reached out, taking her hand. "We have to find out. For Ellen." She nodded, a fragile hope in her eyes. That evening, I sat alone in Grandma's attic room, the diary open before me. The pages seemed to hum with Ellen's presence, begging to be heard. The shadows lengthened as I whispered, "I'm coming, Ellen. I'm going to find you." Chapter 10. Finding Ellen. Days turned into weeks as I pieced together fragments of the past. Old letters, forgotten memories, and whispered stories from distant relatives. The weight of silence that had cloaked Ellen's story began to lift, replaced by a fragile light of understanding. One afternoon, in the town's historical society archives, I found a faded photograph hidden inside an album dated 1970. It showed a small girl with bright, curious eyes, the same long hair and haunting gaze I'd seen in Grandma's drawings. The caption read simply, "Ellen Harper, 15 years old, living at the Maplewood Children's Home." I tracked down the address, a place where children with nowhere else to go were sent decades ago. The building was still standing, worn but sturdy. Inside, the kind woman at the front desk recognized the name. "Yes," she said gently. "Ellen Harper was here. She stayed until she turned 18. Quiet girl. Loved to draw. Left town after she aged out of the home. We lost track after that." I left the home with a bittersweet mix of hope and sorrow. Ellen had survived. She had lived. But her story was still incomplete. Back home, I gathered my family once more, diary and photographs spread on the table like a bridge across time. "We've kept her hidden too long," I said firmly. "It's time to remember Ellen, not as a secret, but as part of our family." Tears flowed, voices trembled, but slowly, walls of silence crumbled. That night, I placed Ellen's diary beside Grandma June's on the shelf. Not buried, but honored. Outside, the wind chimes sang softly in the breeze. Old stories weren't sleeping anymore. They were finally awake.